Well, I was always called, I guess in today's language, you can say a hoarder. Or in those days, we talked about being a rat pack. And then also in those days, as an educator, I was a teacher. And so I collected and I collected. And I felt that when I came across something that was interesting, that I would have some future use. And so I didn't throw out a lot of things that maybe most people would throw out. I kept documents from organizations and associations that I was involved with. I kept special programs of activities of organization, a gala dinner where certain people were honored. I would keep those things. I would find articles either in magazines and community newspapers or in newspaper media in general. And I think it's interesting. It's something I might be able to use for a class, for a discussion, for a round table. Or I might find some way to illustrate. And so I had things that I had collected. And I had one experience that somehow sparked the whole notion that you just can't collect things and then throw them out. And that experience was that of a relative I had who collected everything possible about the monarchy, the queen, the king, the important things in the lives of the queen mother, etc. Just a magazine, pictures, documents, stories. And I remember after she passed away, going with one of her relatives, and all we were doing is taking all these things that she had so nicely, and in those days used to have these big scrapbooks, that she had spent the time in the scrapbook, pasting it in and writing the dates and little comments. And we were just putting it all in boxes and throwing it out. And I left there quite saddened by that. And I always thought that if one had collections, if one had things that were memorabilia, if one had things that could be called historical, if that those things have some value, and those things should be kept, and those things should be in a place where others, years from that time, would look at it again. Oftentimes I think about those boxes that we packed and just threw out in the garbage. And as we now looking at this new group of royals, that would have some kind of significance and comparison and this socio-political life of the nation, as it were, of England at the time when she collected all of this. So I always felt that there's relevance in the collections, in the things you collect, and that you have to find a way for others to share it. And so that was really the impetus for me to have always at the back of my head, these things are not just for throwing out, but these things should be and ought to be in a place where others can come, have a look, find something that's of relevance to them, and that collection of whatever it is, or that document, or that piece of paper, or that tape, or that photograph would have some meaning someplace way, way, way after I passed. Yes, I remember that this photo would have been taken around 1993, and it would have been part of my campaign office. And I brought it to the campaign office because I felt that it was something of interest, that as people, and I did have a lot of interest because some of them had the faces of political figures long gone. Some of the buttons focused on huge campaigns that especially within the Liberal Party. Yeah, from all parties there too. But as people came into the office to assist, to work, to canvass, to do different things, it was always a talking piece. Okay. Oh, I worked on this camp. Oh, I remember this. So it was this was a drapery rod, a curtain rod, and I just hung it on the curtain rod. And even the material has a bit of a story, because there was a time when we did a lot of these material where you had this no, I wouldn't say it was a painting, but it would be material that were appliqué and different things on it, and you would have it as a hanging in the home or in the apartment. And so what I did was I used that, since it was already made and it was already colorful, I started pinning the buttons on it. But the interesting thing about the button collection was as people saw the button, they remember, oh, that they have a button in a drawer someplace at home. Oh, they had more than one, and so they would bring an extra one and pin it on there. So it became a very dynamic, interesting. At the same time, I saw a grandmother once pointing at one of the political buttons and saying, he was our member of parliament when I was growing up, and this is who he was, etc. And she gave his whole story and history. And so it was a kind of teaching, learning from something as simple as collect buttons. No, I have not come back to to look at that button collection, but I'm very conscious of the fact that it's there. And every so often, when I see other buttons, I'm still collecting, because I still have any number of buttons from campaigns, 2000, 2004, 2000, to the present. So anytime I come across a button, I have quite a collection that will be added. Well, what I do, I throw them now into a basket, one of these things that you have in a corner somewhere, and you find a button, you throw it in there. So this is why I have others to add to the collection that would be more relevant maybe for today's young people. Well, I thought this Jamaican Canadian Association one was interesting, simply because the Jamaican Canadian Association was one of the earliest island organization to have a building or to own a building, and also to have a credit union, and to have some activities, join the economic activities. And so I think this was from one of the activities there with their building. Notice the Canadian flag is there, as well as their building and the hands reaching out to community. I thought that was an important one to keep, and I felt it was historical. The National Black Coalition of Canada. This is a button you won't find anywhere now, because this is an organization that died in some way. It was very, very vibrant. What we were doing as Black Canadians were really trying to mimic or to copy the American organization, the NAACP, the National Association of colored people, NAACP. And so we worked really very hard in Canada to bring groups of together, the black community together. We hoped at the time, the vision was to have blacks all across the country, and that there would be a national organization through which we would filter social programs, we will do different things, we would advocate on behalf of the concerns of black people right across Canada. Because what we knew at the time and what we know now is that the situation of African Canadians, wherever they are in this country, is more or less the same. We face racism, we have difficulties in employment, we have difficulties with our young people, we have challenges, whether you're in Halifax, you're in Calgary, or you're in Vancouver or Toronto. We found that those situations were the same, and we felt that a national organization will give us an opportunity to bring our voices together. And of course, the organization lived for a while with really good leadership. There were people like Wilson Head. There were people, Dr. Wilson Head. There was Dr. Howard McCurdy from Windsor. There was Juanita Westmoreland Traore. There was Dorothy Wells from Montreal. And leadership all across the country. And so when we came together in conference. We used to meet in regions, and then we would come together. The national conference would be in one city and then move to another city. Very vibrant, very energetic. But of course, as it says on the button, we were identity, unity, liberation. Were more or less the themes of the work of the National Black Coalition of Canada. As I say, it's no more as a national organization. We lost the impetus for various reasons. One is, how do you fund a national organization where you bring people from coast to coast to coast, and you know the cost of running national conferences. The lack of the necessary funding to support an organization, and also internal bickering around the question of leadership. There was a sense that those people who were in the leadership were a bit elitist. By that, there were voices that were saying, everyone who is an executive member is a doctor this and a doctor that, and that we want our voices as the community to be in this organizing. But what was missed was the fact that those people who were in leadership were also in a position to pay their way or to piggyback on things that they were doing in their own professional life so that they could do the work that was so important. And so when we tried to run an office, a national office, which we did have, it was really very difficult to keep the office open, to pay staff, to do the communication that was important to do. And so there were all kinds of sidebars and different things that somehow the organization had to close its doors. It would be in the 80s, maybe around, it would be in the 80s that it went into demise. There were chapters across the country, and I think a couple of the chapters remained alive. There was a chapter that was going, I think, in one of the western cities, and I think Halifax had a chapter that went for a while. But I think right now we don't have a National Black Coalition of Canada, an organization that speaks on behalf of all the blacks in Canada. This again was one of the early efforts that we had to unify the Caribbean community. And so we were always having efforts And this was one that spoke to the issue of unity. Let's come together, not just Grenada, Barbados, St. Vincent, and whatnot. But if we come together as a West Indian social and cultural society, that we could speak with a voice, we can have an effective voice, and we can do cultural and social things that could promote the Caribbean, the West Indies. And I like that. Again, you would see the theme of a person, and then the hand with the word unity, and that was really kind of a symbol. The North American Black Historical Museum, Amherst, Canada. This is still going. This is where a lot of the history of the Underground Railroad and Southwestern Ontario, etc. Very dynamic, very important museum in Canada in terms of the history and the knowledge and the artifacts that they have of early settlements in that part of Ontario. Notice also and you'd see this in a lot of the buttons that speak to history, geography, or people or culture. The symbols, that the maple leaf, and you'd see the religious aspect of the community, as well as the importance and the integration of the community. So the logos themselves have their own story. The Congress of Black Women. After the I wouldn't say that the death or whatever, but after the unsuccessful, the lack of success in organizing ourselves as across the country as a national black organization, it was felt that the women can do something about doing something successful, organizing ourselves as black women. And we had been involved and engaged in attending several fora, whether it's at the UN level or Pan-African or different places where things were happening for women. And so this came from an International Black Women's Congress, where black women from Africa, United States, Canada, Caribbean came together to discuss issues. And again, it was amazing how, despite where we came from, how the issues were all the same. So whether you were a black woman in Brazil, or you were a black woman in the United States, or a black woman in the UK, or a black woman in Canada, we all seem to have the same issues. And so that button was a button that I picked up at that meeting. Can't remember the city in the US where it was held. Let Black Children Talk. And that was the Congress of Black Women of Canada. Well, maybe I should do this one first, because the Congress of Black Women of Canada was the national organization. And so we had chapters all across the country, and we had regional meetings. Of course, we had our vision statement and our mandate, and we knew exactly as women where we wanted to go with the organization. And it's still alive. There is the foundation that raises funds for scholarships and other things. And one of the interesting things was that we had a theme or a motto or whatever it's called, and it was the vision of black women almost like the cactus. That the cactus is a very hardy plant, and the cactus would grow even if there is no one is kind of nurturing and watering the soil, and that the cactus, despite whatever hardships, at the end springs this beautiful flower, and that we considered ourselves almost like, you know, the cactus, and this was basically a way of a little bit of a fundraiser we had where we sold this this button. This is from the Montreal chapter. And the Montreal chapter, the Congress of Black Women, so it would be the Toronto chapter Congress of Black Women. I think right now we have going, the Mississauga chapter is still alive, and so there were several chapters across the country. And this was a conference that was held in Montreal, focusing on the issue of what today we would call youth, black youth. In those days we talk about, you know, black children. And I remember Rosemary Brown was a speaker at that conference. So was I, a presenter at that conference. And it was Let Black Children Talk. And there were several in the series that they held where they would work with the schools, bring young people in. The young people will discuss their situation, and then of course as the adult, that would be part of the advocacy that we would move on behalf of our children. So this was a conference in Vancouver in 1987, the Congress of Black Women of Canada, on the move forward together. And again, if you notice in all these themes for black folks, we're always talking about how we can work together, because there is quite a diversity, as you know, in the black community. We are from islands, we are from continents, we are from, so you have the Africans, the Americans, you know, and it was for us the challenge was always, how do we come together? So you'd see everywhere the issue of unity, the issue of on the move forward together, and that was in Vancouver in 1987, and that was the election at this conference. I became the national president of the Congress of Black Women of Canada, May the 15th and the 17th, 1987. All right, well, this, it seems to me, focuses more on Caribbean culture as we showed it to Canadians. And so the Calypso King of the World, which was the Mighty Sparrow, and here again the 25th anniversary, 1955 to 1980. And of course, in some of the early Caribana, he was always invited to Toronto and performed during the Caribana time at different occasions. And he would be well known by everyone who follows the Calypso tradition and know about Caribbean music, Caribbean art, genre of Calypso, etc. He's known as the Calypso King. Caribana Adversity. This is an interesting one. This was 1967, because as you know, Caribana started as a result of the community's enthusiasm to do something to celebrate the 100th anniversary of Canada. The Constitution of Canada in 1967. And the parade started at Varsity Stadium, and then we went from Varsity Stadium down to University Avenue, etc. And so this was These were buttons that we had prior to the to get people to assemble at Varsity. So this is where it's going to be part of this new thing, this Caravana thing, and be at Varsity. And Varsity is really the stadium, University of Toronto, on Bloor Street and University. And of course this was a Caravana button. And I think they still may do buttons each year, but there would be different ones. I'm not too sure what year this is, but this would have been the early one, because here is, you know, the CN Tower. Just trying to put the steel band, which is part of the Caravana, and of course the palm tree and the CN Tower, and the connecting up of our presence in Toronto. This was a magazine, and I'm not too sure whether it's still alive. I think it's gone now, overtaken by a whole series of other things that came later. And it was called Caribbean Focus. And it was just maybe about a 32-page magazine or less. But it was all on what was happening in the different islands, and what was happening in Toronto, happening by different Caribbean groups. It was a little interesting magazine. Over the years, I think those people who study what and how communities have evolved, and you know the different things that have happened in communities that brought us together, we know that the whole issue of heritage. There was the Department of Canadian Heritage, and Canadian Heritage funded and supported a lot of activities in the community. And there were special efforts that were made under the whole theme of multiculturalism, multi-ethnic, multiracial, recognizing who we are. And so heritage, there would be special opportunities for the Department of Heritage to support efforts. And sometimes many the community organizations would do things around heritage. And I think this was a program, I don't even remember what group may have gotten funding to do some heritage stuff. But these programs that were supported at the federal level, these programs are gone. And again, this was another celebration, Canadian Heritage Festival, where community groups would come out, your artists, your media people, your music, your dance, a special day, a festival, foods, different things would happen. I know in the city of Toronto we have different festivals now that are occurring, but this again supported by Canadian Heritage.
Do you know approximately the date for?
I would imagine that this one would have been, this would be in the 80s, And Martin Luther King Jr., this was the push for the holiday. And again, as Canadians, we know that Dr. Martin Luther King visited Canada a number of times, visited Toronto a number of times, and that there are a lot of people participated, whether it was a march in Washington or whether it is the principles of nonviolence, or whether those who were religious followed, his religious, or whether those who were looking at the activism and civil rights and all of this. So there's a lot of interest in Canada and a lot of interest among Black Canadians in the work of Dr. Martin Luther King and what he stood for and the messages that came to us. And this was a push for a holiday in his name. And we know the holiday did come about January the 16th, but the holiday is an American holiday. I was in Atlanta with 6 or 8 other Canadians, Charlie Roach, Stan Grizel, and others. We did a week at the King Center, the Martin Luther King Center. And the Martin Luther King Center is where they teach the principles of nonviolence. And you watch the tapes and videos of the different, marches and struggles and whatnot, things pertaining to his life. We also had Mrs. King, Coretta King, come to Toronto, I think on 3 occasions, and she spoke at large assembly meetings and in church, in religious settings. And I think this was a button that was struck to when the community was organizing to ask for a Martin Luther King Jr. holiday, just as there was or there is one in the US. So it was a little bit of a campaign. And again, notice the symbol. It's Dr. King, but we have the maple leaf. In other words, we want the holiday in Canada. Okay, I think a number of these, it seems to me, come from women's organizations. I'll start with this one first. I was a member of the Canadian Advisory Council on the Status of Women, and I was appointed by Prime Minister Trudeau to sit on the Status of Women, the Canadian Advisory Council, and we dealt with a whole series of issues that pertained to, or we advised the government in a whole series of issues for gender equality, for women's equality, for women's inclusion in every aspect of not only law, but in every aspect of the society. And so I think this was a special focus on April the 17th, 1985, which was a specific, what we called a date with equality. So at the bottom here, you can see in small print who did this, the Canadian Advisory Council on the Status of Women. And I was on the council at that time. Again, I'm not too sure about this, but it was within the theme of what we as women need to do and what we as women ought to do, commit to our daughters, commit all to our daughters. Because I think some of the gender issues that we were facing, or the gender issues, the solution to some of the things that we were putting on the table were not for ourselves, but were really for our daughters. Again, this is one of this Equality Day, Equality Under the Law, April 17, the same date with equality and equality under the law. And there were several sidebars for that April the 17th. So here were men of quality and threatened by women seeking equality. And I always liked that because it speaks to the fact that that in the quest for equality, it's not just women, it's not just women should be concerned about women's equality, but that men should be concerned, and that there are men who are concerned about women's equality, and that there are men who could be called feminist, and that there are men who aren't threatened by strong women or women who are seeking equality.
Do you know who?
I'm not too sure who did this, to be honest, but it would have been a men's group. Would have been a male group. Men of quality seeking equality. And I decide, again, that goes back to the question around a woman's right to choose. So in that whole debate around the woman's right to choose, this button was decidedly saying, I decide, as a woman I decide. And that would have been, again, around the 80s. But what is interesting is that was we talking about 1985 and we're talking about those issues. Those issues are as current today. Because the discussions, we have not moved on. We've moved on, but we have not really moved on. These are all around March the 8th. International Women's Day. This one again is back in 85. Women deliver. It's kind of like a little message, a little, And again, a play on words. We deliver babies. But we deliver, and the play on words is really, give us the position in the workplace, and we will deliver the goods. We will perform. We will do everything equally. But it's a play on the word delivery here.
Do you know who was responsible at that time?
I don't remember who did this button. There is something on the side. I'm not too sure if it's a manufacturer or it's the organization. There's something Nova Scotia on the side here, but and again, is the status of women's logo in the middle here. United Nations, 1975 to 1985, the International Women's Decade. As you know, the first United Nations Conference for Women was 75 in Mexico City. And for the first time, the United Nations brought women together to discuss the situation of women around the world. Because of the fact that so much came out on the table in terms of women's lives, women owned did 99% of the work, women owned 1% of the property, women's lives were, the situation of women's lives. So as a result of all that came out in 1995, governments were unsure as to how to move, and the United Nations said, okay, we give you 10 more years, and in 10 years, gender equality, we should reach some kind of equity. And so 1975 was in Mexico City, 1985 was in Nairobi. In 1975, we have Kay Livingstone, who was really, we call the founding member of the Congress of Black Women of Canada. She was at the 1975 conference, so she was in the preparatory work for the 1975 conference. And I went to the conference in Nairobi in Kenya in 1985, together with people like Glenda Sims and and Karen Braithwaite and Eva Smith, that Eva's initiative is named after. And a whole group of us participated in this International Women's Conference in Nairobi. And we stayed in Africa and toured in Africa after that. But if you can see this, there is the shield or the map of Kenya. You can see the Status of Women logo, and you can see the symbol that says women, the circle with the cross in the bottom. So I think I picked this up in Kenya at that conference, the International Women's Conference in Nairobi, 1985. This is a government one, International Women's Day. And again, Journée Internationale de la Femme. And it shows women here in different roles. And I think it was focused on women in the Americas. If you notice, there's South America and North America in the middle, the globe. And then all the activities that women are involved in, you can see in this circle. So again, March the 8th, which is International Women's Day. So that was a button that was struck for that. This is again 1980, International Women's Day. The whole notion, well, you know the notion of bread and roses. And the notion of bread and roses speaks to, you know, those who have and those who are struggling, you know, and the difficulties that there are for people. And so again, a symbol of women, and marking International Women's Day, March the 8th, 1980. There's a theme each year that the community picks up, and I think this was one of the community themes.
The community at which level? Like,
Usually the women's community or the women's organizations in Canada. In various cities there were marches, there were concerts, there were all kinds of events marking International Women's Day. And there's always a theme around the women organized. I won't be surprised if this was a labor union aspect to this button. Some of the buttons that I collected were really messages that we wanted to give, and some of the buttons I wore because I wanted to participate in the strong message. This was this series you have here, Violence Against Women, I think came after the December the 6th killing, where this Lepin had gone into the Polytechnique and just shot these engineering women students. And so this was put out by the CAW, End Violence Against Women. And December the 6th was the date in which that happened. So that was a focus on ending. And one of the things that came up, and you can see it in both buttons, this one was struck in commemoration of the killing in 1989, December 6, 1989. And what happened is after the killing was that these red roses were held up in memory of the young women. And in the front, I was president or chair of the Women's Caucus in Parliament. And what we would do is have a table in front of the Parliament, and we would put, the red roses, almost symbolic in commemoration and in remembrance of the women. So notice here you have this, the red rose, which everyone acknowledges, and all kinds of buttons were made in remembrance of these 14 women in Montreal, December 6, 1989. And notice how the CAW, the union, took the same motif, the same rose, and end violence for our daughters imposed on it. And of course, this is the Federation of Women Teachers, and it's their response, again, no to violence. And I used to wear that as a teacher, and I was very pleased with. And this was an effort in October 1997 by the YWCA to have a week without violence, because there was a time it just seemed that the issues of violence against women in the home, in the marketplace, and in every aspect of a woman's life. And so here again, the YWCA, the dove of peace, symbol of peace, and setting out in 1997 that week of the 19th to the 25th as a week to end violence, or to have a week without violence. And it's interesting where we would ask for a week without violence when what we all wish for is that we would eliminate violence. I was an election observer in South Africa for the 1994 election, and I was sent in 2 or 3 different parts of South Africa to do the election monitoring, and there were different things that we were expected to do. As you monitor, it's not just an election day itself, but prior to that, there were all kinds of activities that occurred. And so this really was what we would call here posters, election posters that were up. And I found this one interesting. One party that was speaking to God and you, and the other was, well, I think these were the 3 parties, but what they were also showing is how you put your, how you vote, how you put your X, because that was part of the situation, was educating South Africans as to how to vote. And if you saw the ballot was a huge long sheet with so many parties and so many names on there. And so this one was again the ANC party. This was one of the, I just lost the name of the party, and this was the ACDP, which was the one about religious one, the God Party. 88 against apartheid. But as you know, in Canada, we were very much in that situation against apartheid, to bring down apartheid. We know the work that was done by our Prime Minister at the time and our Foreign Minister at the time. And in 1988, you can see the struggle here. against apartheid. The call for us really is pronouncing this button, Free South Africa, and that is divest, because the issue was that as long as we continue to invest in South Africa and buy their wine and buy their oranges and invest in their markets and in their industries, that we were not free in South Africa and South Africans. So that again was a very, very, that was one of the buttons I wore. Speak out, South Africa will hear us. And again, it's all the calls that were made across Canada, and the people who were out there encouraging people not to participate in this regime, to speak up, to have their voices heard.
Do you know the names of the groups that were involved in sort of getting the word out and producing these buttons?
There were labor groups, there were church groups, there were religious people, there were community organizations. We had several marches, we had several demonstrations, we had several boycotts. I remember being, was it a Loblaw store, that had the oranges and whatnot, and telling people, showing people the bag, the kind of orange, look for whatever the name was, and you should not buy that kind of orange. And then some people even being bolder, going into the store and standing by the outspan oranges, and as people were picking it up saying, do you know that these oranges is supporting, the same with the wine, and do you know that this is a South African wine, and by buying it, so there were all kinds of boycott.
Did you participate yourself?
Oh, I participated in a number of the demonstrations, the boycotts, the letter writing, the seminars, the speakers that we would invite to come and talk about the situation in South Africa, situation of South Africans. And this is, again, another button that was very, very much out there. Oppose apartheid, oppose racism, boycott South African products. And again, the map to show exactly where South Africa is on the continent. This is a very, very poignant one for me, because when we were in South Africa, Spen Robinson, who was the MP from Vancouver, and I were together. They put us in groups of twos, and we were in the area where Steve Biko grew up and where he lived. So we went to visit his mother and sat on the chair where he usually would sit when he would in his mother's house, and had a conversation with her. Then one of his nephews took us to the hospital where his wife was working, and she took us to the gravesite. And the grass was as tall as we are, with bush and everything else. And I remember Sven and myself and the fellow who was driving the car cleaning Steve Biko's gravesite. And that was before the election. So that's, and of course everyone knows Steve Biko's struggle against apartheid and the fact that he was killed. Yes, oh yes, oh yes, that night was an incredible night. And we spent that night in Ciskei. We had the results in Ciskei. And we saw one flag come down and the ANC flag go up. It was, and you see people crying, just the tears. I remember the occasion when we had a driver who took us around South African drivers, because we were in, I think, 2-3 cars wherever we went. We had our CMP security, they were in one car, and Sven and I were in another car, and we had a third car with all the things that we needed for security. And well, that's a group of us when we arrived in South Africa. Peter Milliken, who became the Speaker of the House sometime later, myself, Spen Robinson, I just lost his name now. And the 17th, we were at that's university with Waxer, and I can't remember the name of it. But that was a university where we got the briefing as to how to behave and what to do and what to look for. So the briefing was given at the university. So you can see the 3 days. Yeah, we were in the Cape. This may have been Soweto. I'm wondering where this jacket went. Justice with dignity. Remember Kimberly Rogers. Justice for Albert O. Johnson. The truth of the matter, I don't remember this Kimberly Rogers story. But I can tell you I was on the ground floor and I was in all the activities around Albert Johnson. Albert Johnson was one of the earliest police killings in the black community that got national and international attention. He was he had some mental illness. He was known to the police. And whatever occurred, they went to see him, and he was eating something and had a knife in his hand. And whatever occurred, he was shot. And so the community was really, just as we've had recently, where everybody is very upset, asking for justice. And that was before we had police-community relations. That was before we had SIU. That was before we had all of the checks and balances. And so the community had to organize and demonstrate and push and get legal help and get all kinds of voices. And the whole campaign was called Justice for Albert Johnson.
So was there anything done?
I'm not too sure what the final resolution was. where the police was charged and then, as happens in most cases, not convicted. I forget now, my memory just has gone completely blank on what the end result, but there was just activity day in, day out, marches on the street, Dudley Laws, Charlie Roach, and all those.
Do you know what year this was? What time? Albert Johnson.
Would have been in the 80s, the early 80s. Denham Jolly would know the story of this. He follows a number of these incidents with dates and times and whatnot. I don't remember. I mean, I know it would have been in the 80s. I can see myself now down the street where he lived. I can see the marches. I can see the group of us who spent time with his wife talking, consoling and talking. The evidence that was built, the steps the police had to go in. The fact that he had some kind of disability, so he wasn't a swift-bodied, healthy-bodied man. And the fact that he was known to the police in the area as someone who walked the street talking to himself and stuff like that. But it was one of those things that really ripped the community and where there was a sense that he was killed in his house and that there was quite an injustice. Kimberly Rogers, I don't remember. Yeah, this is all multiculturalism. A big festival that is held in Windsor. Again, around the whole issue of, and in those early days we spent a lot of time kind of defining who we were. That we came from here, we came from there, we came from the other, and we need to bring all of our talents and skills together, and we need to respect each other, and we need to recognize diversity as a strength, and we need to work as community of nations. And so this was, I used to go to this on an annual basis. And actually I was very much engaged with the Caribbean groups in Windsor as they formed a group called Windsor Women Working with Immigrant Women. But that carousel still happens on an annual basis. It's like a big Caribbean festival. I mean, again, this gives the same kind of message as the Carousel of the Nations. And this speaks more to the diversity in Canadian society. And notice again the holding of the hands in the circle, that we need all to come together, recognizing and respecting each other. And it's the same message with this carousel. Again, we're all different, but we are coming together. Celebrate our differences. And that was the early themes of the multicultural programs and the festivals, the different things that we did, the dance, the music, the food, those early days. I know that there were people who knocked that, but at the same time, that was a way to get to know your neighbor, get to know your friends. That was the time when we learned each other's foods. I would imagine that that was the time I learned pierogi, and you learned different, apart from, I think everybody knew the Chinese food, but we didn't know a lot of food that came from different places. And when we celebrated our difference, when we came together, either at the workplace, having a potluck, and everybody bringing something from their culture, at the same time that we are all part of Canadian society, yet we bring different baggage, and therefore let's celebrate that. And this is the same message: become our partner, let's hold hands together. This was one put out by the Department of Multiculturalism. We're Canadian, take it to heart. And again, it's under the maple leaf. We're all Canadians. 40 years of Canadian citizenship, that again was put out by the Department, 47 to 87. That celebration. And 1947 was important because 1947 was the year when we started with Canadian citizenship. Because as you know, before that, we were British subjects. And again, the play on the differences, different color, different shapes, different sizes. Growing together. You see, it's the same, it's a theme. And I think this is what makes us as a country different to a lot of other countries that's struggling to integrate people into their society. And of course, this is Canadians from all walks of life. And I think it's a little bit of a mark to the men who sat around the table to sign. But here you have age and gender and disability and everyone coming around the table together. And the message is that we are all Canadians. I was a minister for multiculturalism. And those messages were the messages we give. Celebrate our difference. Partner with us. Yeah, I was big on the anti-racism buttons because I felt that they gave clear messages. And I must tell you that the Canadian Labour Congress and many of the unions all stood very firmly on the anti-racism theme. And I think they need to get credit for ensuring that the message that racism must be stopped. And as the Minister for Multiculturalism at the time, we used to run a program, a video in schools to stop racism. We can stop racism, and have kids come up with the messages in 3 to 4 minutes on a video. And if you remember, we used to have lots of things with their hands, like stop racism, stop it. Together, protect human rights and discrimination. There are umpteen buttons. Have courage, stand up against hate and racism. Spring free from racism. And as you know, March the 21st is the United Nations International Day. Against racism and racial intolerance, xenophobia, and all kinds of intolerance. And of course, this was a big, I think our memories have gone now to past the recollections around the Toronto Sun and the writers and the people who were writing all kinds of things that were considered to be prejudicial, to be racist, and and to create or to have stories that created a lot of tension in the community. And so the Toronto Sun was always viewed as a racist paper. There are still a lot of people who don't read the Sun because of that past history. We know some of the people have gone. We know the Sun has had different editorial positions now. But there was a time when the Sun was really a cause of concern for people in not only in the black community, but people in the sidelines of society.
Do you know what time period that was?
Oh, the Sun? Oh my goodness, it was all the 70s and the 80s.
Do you remember some of the stories that were written at that time?
Well, it was not so much the kinds of stories, but it's really the tone of the stories, the descriptors that would be used, like the words that would be used to describe individuals, and also the hardline positions that were put forward in terms of race. So, for example, the story would be, why should we have to do employment equity? There'd be all kinds of viewpoints around that, or in the case of the police shootings and the marches and things that were happening, how it was reported. Or in the instance of things that were happening in public housing, how that was reported versus how something was reported if it happened in another part of town. So there were lots of, the Toronto Sun, and people were writing, demonstrating, passing out buttons, doing all kinds of things. And one of the things sometimes that we forget is the fact that every so often we have in various Ontario communities, the Ku Klux Klan would come and infiltrate, put posters out, or do different things. And so this was a Ban the Klan Committee for Racial Equality. And I think it was I don't remember the name of the small town, but they had come into the town and, with leaflets and pamphlets and speaking out against people in the community. And so these buttons were struck. Yes, Canada in 92, no, Brian in 93. What would this be now? We had several campaigns when Quebec was making its push for separation. And so this was saying yes to Canada, stay in Canada. And I'm not too sure what Brian is Brian Mulroney. And Brian Mulroney in 93, I'm not too sure. No Brian, and it may be no vote for Brian, don't vote for Brian in 93, because the big election was in 93, and that's where the Conservatives lost all but 2 seats in the House. And the Liberals picked up under Jean Chrétien. That was the year I was elected. So it seems to me this has something to do with Quebec separation. Those were buttons struck by the Liberal Party of Canada in 1993 in the campaign, so that all the candidates wore a button to indicate that they were the Liberal Party member and that Jean Chrétien was the leader. There is a difference here, if you notice, and again, it's a kind of internal thing, where in the very first campaign they had him with a suit jacket on. Then smart campaigners came along and say they want him to look young and with it and whatever else. So we went from taking the suit off, and then we went further from taking the suit off to putting him in a jean jacket. And again, to give the appearance of youth and with it and whatnot. So you can see the progression here of him looking almost like an older man. They keep saying, for 93 and for the campaign, you have to get out there and you have to. And so everybody wore, the button of Jean Chrétien on there. And of course, this was my campaign button in 93. He came out to canvass with me a few places. And so that's him canvassing with me. And then we played in my campaign on the name Jean, which is also Jean. Look at my afro, huh? And so all of my workers had these campaign buttons. And again, it was identifying. These buttons really show identification with the leader. Everybody liked him. He was up front. He was the one on TV. He was the one who was everywhere. And therefore, you wanted to wear a button with the leader. Or you wanted to wear the leader's button to show that you're liberal and to show that. This is interesting. The unrobing. First the jacket, then take out the jacket. Shirt and tie, then take out the tie and put a blue jean jacket on him and give him that young, youthful, preppy look. And we won. We won by big numbers. When Paul Martin came on the scene, again, this is one of the leadership candidates. So once you're a leadership candidate, you have the buttons that everybody would wear. Oh. And in the campaign for leadership, those who were going to be voting for him would wear this. So you see, it has no other sign on it except his name, Paul Martin. So you'd wear that, and this would be a sign that you're voting for him. So then those who were canvassing the room and whatnot would leave you alone because you've already signaled. Then when you become the leader, you have your button now. Everybody knows you're liberal, and that's the leader. This is what went out again with the other, as you want to show that you're part of whatever the team was, and so they would do these buttons that go out to all the candidates. So it's kind of like, Team Martin. I also think that was part of the undoing of the Liberal Party, when instead of, Team Liberal, we were Team Martin. And of course, the National Women's Liberal Commission in the supports Paul Martin. And again, that's a leadership, the leadership race. So instead of leaving it to each woman, each member to decide, the executive and the entire commission went for Paul Martin. By then there weren't a lot of people standing. It was just Sheila Copson himself towards the end. When I was chair of the Liberal Women's Caucus, well, I should begin by saying who are the Liberal Women's Caucus. It's all the women who were elected in the Parliament and those who were appointed in the Senate who were Liberals. So we will have a lunch every Wednesday, and all the women will come together and we'll talk about what legislation is coming up, what position we see as women. We will discuss the issues from a women's perspective. We would make some decision as to, what we would, if we were going to speak on the issue, what kind of aspect of of that piece of legislation. And at the same time, we would discuss some other issues important to us. Many of the women were parents with kids back home. Many of them come from all different parts of the country and were far from home and had several, things that affected their lives and wanted an opportunity to talk. So it was our time having lunch together. This is a very special room in the Parliament of Canada, in the restaurant. That was a room where, Trudeau would meet with, VIPs for lunch, a special meeting. And so we had this room, and we will be served in the room. And one of the things that I initiated at the time was bringing in ministers, the Prime Minister and ministers, especially if they were propelling different pieces of legislation. So here I invited the Prime Minister to have lunch with us. So that was the head table. There I am to his right, and to his left was my co-chair in the Senate. And we ordered lunch and just sat and ate and sat and chat. It was an opportunity for us to talk to the Prime Minister, just in an informal setting around the table.
Do you know what year this photo might have been taken?
This would be 1994.
And approximately how many? Because these are all female MPs or Senate.
Yes.
Senators. So.
Yeah, women, members of Parliament and senators.
And they were all just liberals, right? Or just
All liberal, because at the time we found it really the women who were in there were from the Reform Party. The Conservatives were down to 2 seats at the time, so there was just Elsie Wayne, and the party with a significant number of women were the Reformers had some women, not very many. But we were not on the same page, despite the fact that we were all women. The issue of choice, the Reform Party wasn't. There were several reasons why we couldn't get together as all women, because ideologically we stood so far apart.
But it seems like a larger group, right? Like the number of women that were.
Oh yes, there were it was definitely over 50. I just see Shaughnessy Cohen here. She was the one from Windsor who passed away in the house. This was my button that throughout the campaign, and we used it for several things. People who were going out to canvass for me would put a button on them. So as they knock at the door, people would see, the day from the Jean Augustine campaign. We handed it out to people who came out to help. And it was really the campaign button. This one was an earlier one when we talked about the Jean team. And here is the implication that it could be the Jean team, meaning Jean, Chrétien, and myself, or the Jean, all those who came to help became part of the team. And so that's the Jean team. That's Women in Red. That's part of the liberal fundraising event for women.
For your button, did you have much say on the design of your button, or was it?
No, what they did with the button, they made the buttons for all the members, together with a campaign package. And so every other member's button would be the same, which is part of the package. So you paid for the package with X number of buttons. This is provincial politics here, and this is, I guess, McGuinty's leadership, because it was a hotly contested leadership. I don't remember the year now, but that's not hard to find. So that's Dalton. And this is Dalton as the leader. So one is his campaign button for leadership.
So, did you wear these buttons?
I didn't support Dalton for the leadership until the very end, when the person I was supporting kind of walked over to him, and we all went over. So I didn't wear this button, but I think I wore this one at something. And one of the things that happens in these leadership, where there are 4 or 5 people running, they bring you their button. And when you accept the button and put it on, then it shows that you're moving to their team. Jesse Jackson in '88. Well, Jackson, as you know, he made a run, and that was one of his campaign buttons. For president, yeah, President of the United States. Now is the time. I think was it 2 tries he made, or was it? Because this one is '84, so maybe this was when he was gearing up for '88. I met Jesse Jackson a couple of times.
And did you wear it? Was there a campaign on this side of the board?
No, the campaign was in the U.S. There was nothing, as far as I know, there was nothing on this side in terms of a campaign.
So how did you get the buttons?
I may have been in the U.S. Well, that was Gerard Kennedy. I was Gerard Kennedy who was running, and I think I went to volunteer, and they write my name on this. But that would be his button, and my name would be the top. I don't think it's in there. Oh yes, well you help everybody so they come and help you, you know. During most campaigns you would go out, even though you canvassing or you campaigning on your own campaign, you would go out and help, you know, go to someone else. Usually they say one evening, can you come out with us in this specific area or for this specific reason? And you would go out with a colleague. But by the time Gerard was running, I think I was out of, I don't remember when that button would have been. Maybe when he was, maybe the 2007 campaign. Morris Bishop, the 5th anniversary of the revolution, March 13, 1984. His spirit lives. Yeah, but this is Grenada politics. And you know, they had a revolution there when the opposition decided that they would become the government, and then whatever happened in the end, where Morris Bishop got killed and whatnot. I was in Canada at the time, but there were lots of supporters of Morris Bishop here, Grenadians in the diaspora. And so I think these buttons were circulating. Oh, the W5. I was speaking about the W5 only yesterday. I was talking about the W5. W5 was a program on television, and it was what, when, where, why, you know, the media. But what they did was a program that that gave the research and the stats that showed that in medical schools and in research, I think, that you had over, that Asian students, the impression they gave was that the medical schools were overrun by Asian students, and almost implying that Canadian students weren't able to get in because the Chinese and the other Asian students were taking all the place in medical school. And so the program was very explosive, and the community reacted really, really very badly at the way in which the Asian students were portrayed, and the whole notion about the presence of Asian students in medical schools. So these, there were marches, there were demonstrations, there were protests, both at the station and at the university. And there were conferences, and there were discussions about that whole issue. And so these buttons were struck that were part of the fundraising for the campaign.
Do you know what,
I think there were.
year this was?
I was talking about that just the other night, because again, there's a lot of discussion now around the universities and colleges going out to Asia and places and setting up satellites and encouraging, and now with the foreign, those students are now, through our immigration policies, are allowed to stay. and the discussion around the composition of classes would be something that the folks I was talking to were talking about this, and I kind of referred them to this whole issue of the W5. You have to be careful how we approach the issue or speak about the issue.
Do you know if there was any resolution between this? Was there
Yes, I think at the end, I'm not too sure if there was so much an apology as it was some way in which they did another program that counteracted the program that they held before, that they did before.
I don't remember if was this in the 90s, the 80s?
Well, no, it would have been in the 80s.
80s, okay.
The reason that, most of these things are in the 80s because once I got into politics, a lot of these protest marches and whatnot, I didn't participate in those things. Well, I think maybe 100 years from now, they look at these things and say, how silly, how much money was spent making these buttons, because I'm sure even in today's technical computer, world that, they're doing things a little differently. The things that they use as identifiers may be completely different. They may have some other way of getting you identified rather than walking around with a button. They'd have other ways to know, to keep your confidentiality, because one of the things about the buttons is that they immediately identify where you stand. So you have a Paul Martin button, or you have a Gerard Kennedy button, or you have a Jean Chrétien button, and so people knew where you stand. When you wore the buttons, you were immediately, there was no secrecy in terms of who you were supporting. I think the other is the fact that we are also very conscious of everything being green and everything being whatnot. 100 years from now, they look at this and say, my God, they contaminated for these political messages. And I think we're not using, when you go back, even looking from then to now, I'm not too sure that we use the buttons so much to give our messages as the fact that we use the Twitter and we use the Facebook and we use the photographs rather than passing a message out, saying, no smoking, and done with racism, da-da-da-da-da. I'm hoping that a lot of the stuff around that we had to protest against, that we won't be protesting those things, and we would not be looking at these ways to convince other people by getting them to take a button and wear the button and show the button so that is their position. Well, I think I was a collector of all kinds of stuff. The buttons were just more tangible. And I'll tell you how the whole issue of the button collection came about. My daughters were in Brownies. And one afternoon I was taking them to Brownies. And my older daughter, Valerie, says, Mom, I have to bring a collection. I have to give a collection. And I said, what do you mean? I have to collect something that's 6 or 8 of the same thing. And I said, I don't have 6 or 8. Why didn't you tell me? You know how you go through as a, why didn't you tell me that last week when you came back from the... So I started kind of hunting around, pulling drawers out and pulling things out and seeing what, what I can get that she can mount on this ribbon to take. And in one of the drawers, I found these buttons, some buttons that I had collected. So I took 8 of them and I make her pin them onto this ribbon thing. And that was her collection that she took in. And of course, once she brought it back, we started kind of adding on the piece of ribbon. And the issue of the buttons as political, and I'm sure when you went through the others, I had buttons from everywhere, not just politics. It just came about. It was a neat thing. And once you start a collection, you put it up. I had it up in my basement, and people would come in and out and see it. And somebody would give you something else. So I have buttons from all places and far-off places and everything, because people saw that you had the collection, just wanted to add to the collection. But it gave me great pleasure. It was also a neat thing, like someone would stand forever when I brought it to the campaign office and put it up. That was the first kind of outside the house, public viewing kind of stuff. People would stand forever reading the buttons and looking at the buttons. And I lost quite a bit too. There were people who took. Well, the violence, the multiculturalism, the equity issues, violence against women, the community organizations where we were building together and moving as a community. I mean, those were all very critical and important issues, and those are issues I care passionately about.